Hey, and welcome back to the number one podcast in the world, the Sailorcast, episode 165. So my past week has been interesting. It's been interesting for me, despite the fact that I haven't left the house very much, because I have been getting completely wrapped up into wizardry. That's right. I think that this entire episode is just going to be a wizardry it's probably not going to be that long, but it's just going to be we're going to do a wizardry retrospective. I don't know. It's not the full series. There were no questions from last time, and I didn't really have anything. Again, my week was not very eventful. Was it? Did I do anything? No, not really. Most of it has just been working on the next video. A lot of my thoughts and playtime, because I'm talking about a specific game, has all kind of been pointed towards one game in particular, and it's given me a lot to write about. I had to take pretty in-depth notes on like the footage that I got because there was a lot to talk about. You'll see when it comes out. It's a fairly dense game. I was talking to Kat, and she's like, is this going to be like TLC again? I'm like, oh, I think it's going to be like TLC. I don't think it's going to be as long. But in terms of, this will be like a fun, interesting, weird thing that might last like, it'll be like a 30-minute video, maybe. And then I finished it. I'm like writing the TLC video, and it's like 2 hours. It's like a feature-length film. Probably won't be that long. I doubt it. But pardon, I also just like drank some milk, so my throat's a little phlegmy. I might be clearing it early on. Other than that, I decided that because I had the time and at my leisure, I had recently gotten Wizardry 6, 7, and 8 on Steam. There was a sale where they were all super cheap, and I said, hey, why not? Let's I have heard about wizardry, but I've always, it feels like a blind spot of something I should at least touch, just to understand. Because if you don't know, wizardry is actually really important. If you haven't even really heard of it, the Wizardry series was started in 1980. Which was the first one? It was like, I'm going to say it was... Hang on, I have the chart here. 81, all right? It was started in 1981, originally on the Apple II with Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. However, actually, this sort of ties into something that, in a very old video of mine, it was actually based on the dungeon crawlers that were on the Plato mainframe system. Ooh, we're going to go back. We're going to do the whole history, baby. So let's stretch all the way back. We'll go all the way back in time to World War II and the development of computers. After World War II, I made a video on this like years ago. So after World War II, we introduced something called the GI Bill, or I guess during World War II in America. The GI Bill was essentially a list of benefits that you would get for serving in the military. One of which was you would get the government would just pay for you get a free ride through college. Essentially, it was almost like a scholarship program. So what that meant, so it's actually kind of interesting because it is kind of led to like the college education fetishizing in like current day America, because you had an entire generation of people practically who went to college because there was mandatory conscription for men in the U.S. during World War II. And also in like the Vietnam War, every war that we had where we were like, hey, we're gonna throw a bunch of guys into this thing, a lot of them used the benefits to go through college. So this led to like a kind of interesting situation in the later decades, because now it was like an expected thing that you were supposed to go to college, and there was an immense influx of students. And one of the challenges to this was like, damn, the facilities are literally not like our programs and our facilities are not really built to handle this massive wave of people coming in, you know? Higher education was considered like a track that was equal, you know, alongside, you know, going to a trade school or starting your own business or just, I don't know, going into some other profession, right? Like some people would just graduate high school and go straight into working at something. It wasn't common in the United States to jump straight into college or jump directly to college from high school. That's actually a slightly modern thing. And historically, that wasn't really the trend. So one of the things that they came up with starting in like the 60s was, hey, we had all these computers that were developed is for like military purposes. How is it possible to potentially use these computers to educate people more efficiently, basically? Can we do like computer-based learning? So there were lots of experiments, and this led to a couple mainframe computer systems. Mainframes were basically, imagine like a localized internet. So for instance, the Plato mainframe system, I forget what Plato stands for, was at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Shout out. Woo! Shout out Illinois. It was really funny reading about that because I literally have like friends from when I lived in Illinois who like go there. And I'm like, whoa, did you know that it's actually super important to computer history? And they're like, that's cool, Tiger. So mainframe systems are essentially like you have a bunch of computer terminals. And they're called terminals because they're like the endpoints of the system, like the endpoints of the like octopus arms of this system, where each terminal connects to like a big whole, right? A big whole network that is mostly confined to just like, I don't know, the college. There were a certain number of terminals in the computer labs and other places around that were connected to it. And for the most part, the Plato mainframe system was intended for like educational stuff, you know, communications, early forms of email and instant messaging. There's a ton of like pretty interesting innovations and inventions that came from that. But eventually, obviously, people got kind of bored and they explored. These are really, really early video games. Essentially, were made on the Plato. This is back in the 60s. And, you know, computers were very uncommon, and someone making games on them would be even less common. It was just kind of the fact that this was in a university with, like, bored 20-somethings, 20 and 30-somethings who were some of the few people in the world who understood programming. So, what does someone in the 60s and 70s, what kind of games do you think that they make? They just try to make Dungeons and Dragons because it's like, that's like the game, right? It's interesting, but this is pre-video games. It's like, what else what other high concept games do you have to go off of? For most people, it was just kind of Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know, maybe Risk? Something like that. If that even existed at that point. I'm not an expert on board game history. Forgive me. So I made this video where you can actually access the Plato. It's still like hosted. You have to like email a guy to get access to it and go through their own particular emulator, like front end thing to use it. But it is still accessible, and it was very interesting to go back and play these like primal video games. And it was kind of hilarious how many of them were just first-person dungeon crawlers. There were, no joke, like 30. There were like 30 of these games, at least, that all followed a very similar formula of first-person wireframe graphics, dungeon crawling, random encounters, very simple, just like, how do we put Dungeons and Dragons into like a visual medium that's not just pen and paper. These eventually became the inspiration for games that came out a little bit later, namely Wizardry in this case. So they all have this kind of interesting starting point. I believe the first one was literally just called D&D on the Plato. But the game Oubliette is typically singled out as being one of the primary specific inspirations, as like that was the particular game that the original creators of Wizardry, those being Andrew C. Greenberg and Robert Woodhead. So essentially, the first so this begins Wizardry in 1981 on the Apple II. There are in total 8 mainline Wizardry games, although there are a ton of spin-offs, namely in Japan. So you might not, one of the reasons that you probably haven't, if you're listening to this podcast, that if you haven't heard of Wizardry or only vaguely heard of it, is because it's really big in Japan specifically. It's kind of like, I was almost going to say kind of like their Final Fantasy, but that's a Japanese thing. It's hard to come up with like a good metaphor or something, because it's kind of, it's sort of particular. I can't think of that many things which started in one very particular culture and country, got super big elsewhere to the point that it, and was maybe not like incredibly popular there, but got even bigger in like a different country and got a bunch of like continuations there. I don't know. It's very specific. But those the early Wizardry games were huge inspirations for Japanese RPGs. And if you go and look at the conventions, the standard formula of Wizardry, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious where the inspirations came from. Every Wizardry game opens up with creating a party of anywhere from like 4 to 6 adventurers. You pick race and class and sex and all the regular basic kind of character creation stuff. You start at the dungeon, and then in the like original formula of the original trilogy, you go into the dungeon from the top level, and it's essentially like a battle of attrition. It's about knowing like when to make tactical retreats and go back to the surface to rest up at town and buy new equipment and stuff, and when to kind of push further and kind of push your luck. That's the gameplay loop of the original Wizardries. I am not particularly interested in playing them for a couple of reasons. Number one, the games have a permadeath system. Now, when I say permadeath, I don't mean it's like, oh no, let me just reload my save. So when your party gets wiped in Wizardry 1, 2, and 3, it takes you to a screen that overwrites your save game and boots you back to the title and says, yeah, they're all dead and gone. Fuck you. This is only really alleviated if you play the originals on because they were re-releases on other consoles like the NES and the SNES and stuff. If you play them on that and use on an emulator and use save states, you can get through it. But they are very basic dungeon crawling adventures that are kind of mean and in many ways brutal and unforgiving. I can't say I'm terribly interested in that. The other reason is that Wizardry 2 and 3 aren't really sequels as much as they are expansions. So initially, Wizardry 2 had to be played by importing a party from the first game. You actually could not start from scratch. You had to have a save file from the first game of a party and then transfer it when you booted up the second game. It was also designed around the idea that you had finished the first game. So you've made it through the permadeath nightmare of Wizardry 1. You have a party that's like a certain level, like 13 or whatever, was what I read, was like the rough, that was where they kind of wanted you to start at for the second game. And it was just a continuation, essentially. And Wizardry 3 was much the same. The second game eventually, I think a couple later releases allowed you, I think especially console releases probably, allowed you to start from scratch and create a new party. However, it did not account for that and wasn't designed around it. So there was no like low level training area. You were just immediately thrown into the fire. I think they literally called it a baptism by fire. If you were to even hope to survive. So 2 and 3 kind of 1, 2, and 3 are sort of the same game in a way. In the modern day, they would just be considered expansions or DLCs of the first one, something like that. If you're going to play it today and that sounds intimidating to you, I'm not sure exactly what changed. There was a remake, a modern day remake. Probably recommend looking into that one as something a little more approachable. The number one word I would use to describe the Wizardry series overall is prickly, in that it is kind of difficult to touch. It's difficult to touch. Wizardry 4 was such a piece of shit that everyone hated that they don't even acknowledge it. They want people just pretend it doesn't exist. And the only people who are into it are, like, people who admit that it's a fucked up game for crazy people. But, reading about it, it's a very interesting sounding game. So Wizardry 4 was a break from the formula. It has a really cool concept. Okay, so here's the idea. At the end of Wizardry 1, so the whole game is about killing a wizard. You defeat an evil wizard at the end. Wizardry 4, you play as the wizard. And instead of going down into the dungeon to fight, the final boss, you start at the bottom of the dungeon where you've been, like, imprisoned. And you have to work your way back up to the surface it's like his revenge story. And he is very weak himself. But the idea is that I don't think you really do too much. You're not very capable on your own, but you summon minions that are like different creatures. Essentially, you're summoning dungeon mobs to fight for you as your party, which is like a really cool idea. Unfortunately, everything I've read about this game is like the most asshole-ish thing ever. So here's how the first room of Wizardry 4 is. Because apparently, most people don't make it out of the first room. You're like, how is that possible? What is so messed up about the first room of the game? So you start and there's no doors, it's just walls. There is seemingly no way out, and sometimes, but just because of the rules of the game, sometimes you just get into random encounters. Oh, and all the enemies you fight are adventuring parties. They're all like adventuring like player parties. You're not fighting monsters. You're controlling the monsters. and fighting the adventurer parties that have ventured down into the dungeon to kill you again. So, and apparently they are just like fucked up. They're like almost like modded, ridiculous power level, like fighters that attack. I read like, oh yeah, the fighters attack like 16 times in a row because their stats are so cracked out, and like everyone has like health that they have like health that breaks the overflow of like counter of the game. They have just so fucking mean. And also you don't actually gain experience and levels. You only increase in power if you get to specific points on each floor of the dungeon. That's the only thing. So doing battles doesn't even help you. It doesn't actually like progress you unless maybe there's some kind of specific item you have to get or something like that. But in terms of stats and experience and progression, it like doesn't. It's just there to hurt you. So how do you get out of the first room of Wizardry 4? Well, you have to know that there is a secret door. Okay, how do I find the secret door? You have to reveal it. How do you reveal it? You need to cast the spell like Mawali or something. However, you cannot cast the spell yourself. You have to, the main character cannot cast that spell. What you have to do is run around until you get into a random encounter. You have to summon a group of priests for yourself, and priests are the only guys who can use the light spell. However, you cannot directly control your party besides the wizard. So you just have to hope that they randomly cast it, and then assuming you survive the battle, the light spell will have been cast and the door will be revealed when you get out of the battle. Just absolutely fucking awful. Just like a nightmare. It's like the legacy of the druids of CRPGs, just for fucking crazy people, but kind of charming from what I can gather. Genuinely, like, even people who are like really into, okay, the worst types of guys, some of the worst types of guys, and no one talks about them because they just hang out in their own corners, are CRPG boomers. They're one of the worst groups that you can ever read. Like, I was just trying to get some info and do some research, and I looked at like I look at like some CRPG like forums that are still going and like relatively recent threads. And I'm just looking, and just everyone, it just devolves. It's literally like reading, it's like a 4chan spinoff. Everyone just starts calling people slurs. Everyone is just, it's just so fucking annoying sounding. And you know, all of these people are like 40 plus. And everyone gets so elitist. It's like, it might be the worst community in terms of elitism is, you don't want to deal with that? You must be a casual. I guess it's not made for you. Just like the most annoying. And even they will be like, yeah, 4 is like, it's interesting. It's like the nicest thing they can say about it. A lot of like CRPG boomers I found are just people who are like really proud of the fact that they hit the slot machine over and over again until they got a jackpot, because that's how a lot of old CRPGs play, in my opinion. Ooh, am I being a hater? Am I being a stupid, ignorant zoomer? I guess maybe I am. I'm sorry that I like to play my games and not play against my games. So then after that was Wizardry 5. 5 is interesting because it was designed by a fellow named... let me make sure. I literally just had... Yeah, David W. Bradley. So he actually... Wizardry 5 did not start as a Wizardry game. It was just Bradley's own game. And he sent it to the publisher of Wizardry, a company called SurTech. And they liked it, but they wanted him to essentially rewrite it to be a Wizardry game. So he took a little bit of time to do it, but then they were also like, hey, we already announced Wizardry 4 like a year ago, and it's taking like a long time to make. So we're just going to hold on to Wizardry 5 until that game is out. So there's this kind of weird release history where there's this like 4-year gap between 3 and 4. 4 comes out, and then the next year 5 comes out, which I think they were happy to do because 5 was basically like a classic CRPG and not the weird experimental shit they were doing with 4. 5 was generally much better received, and people, they call it a return to form for the Wizardry series. It wasn't a Wizardry game. Don't tell anyone. It wasn't supposed to be a Wizardry game. And then there's another long lull in the series entries. Actually, it's not too long. It's like 88 to 90. And that is when David Bradley takes over as the main writer and designer of the games. And this is where I come into this story, because this is where I started playing them over the last week with Ultimas 6 through 8. So interestingly, because of this weird fucked up history that the series has, the first 3 games are considered the first trilogy, and then they just kind of skip 4 and 5, and then 6 through 8 are the second trilogy. They call them like the second wave, largely because, well, for a couple reasons. Number one, it was when it was when Bradley, it's because he's got 2 first names, David and Bradley. I keep wanting it to be something else. Bradley, there is a notable, looking at the early games and then that second wave trilogy starting with 6, there is a noticeable difference. It feels like those first 5 are traditional fantasy games, and then after that, Bradley starts kind of turning them into something that he wants. He takes it in a slightly different direction. One which I actually I like. I like it a lot. I probably like it more than the originals, for very specific reasons, which aren't apparent in 6, but are immediately apparent in 7. So, Wizardry 6 is essentially, it made a big break from the earlier titles in that you could not import characters from previous games. You could not take your party from 5 and put them into 6. It was meant to be like a clean break, another kind of reason why it's considered the second wave. It's also a complete overhaul of the graphics engine, and rewrote. I'm not super familiar with Wizardry's systems, especially in the earlier games, but 6 rewrote a lot of things about the game and the formula. For instance, there's no returning to town. You just go into the dungeon and that's it, and you kind of recover to make up for that. All the loot you find in the game is generally like useful equipment, and also you can rest. There is an option to rest, so that you don't have to backtrack all the way back to town, because there is no town. So 6 is also a very classic traditional dungeon crawler that is about, they tell you up front that there's this thing called the Cosmic Forge. This game is called Bane of the Cosmic Forge, and it has been stolen, I guess, by it's this quill. It's this pen quill that can write the laws of reality. So this super powerful artifact, and it's been stolen away to this castle that you got to go find it now. And the game to that point is adventuring. It's adventuring in a dungeon in a castle. I'll be honest, I didn't make it past like 2 or 3 hours in the game. So I went, and out of curiosity, I read what like the whole story was. You do make it out of the castle. And you go into like more open areas and stuff. You go into mountains and you meet other characters and things like that. But the game is very front loaded with dungeon crawling. The main thing that turned me off from it was just like, okay, there is a certain kind of old school RPG sensibilities that I don't really jive with. And that is having a dice fetish. All these guys are just like gambling addicts. All these designers. It actually, it makes me, it reminds me of an anecdote from the development of Diablo 3. So I've been reading Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier, and one of the stories, one of the chapters in that book is about the making of Diablo 3, and namely not just the development of it, but specifically the development of its expansion, like half sequel thing, Reaper of Souls. Yes, that's what it was called. So Diablo 3 was a pretty infamous like botch on release, just tons of issues and problems and bad decisions, and the game, they were used to, the Diablo series kind of had these big expansions, and they brought on a bunch of new people for the expansion to Diablo 3, and one of their goals was, it isn't just going to be an expansion, it's going to be like, it's an opportunity to essentially revamp the game, to completely rework how a bunch of things work to try and improve it. So one of the things was that, number one, it was it's this interesting kind of tangled web that they had to work through, because some of the new ideas were good, some of the new ideas were bad, and also certain things that they were adhering to, certain core identity parts, the things that they considered core parts of the series, were not really working out, or were being like interpreted badly, namely the RNG. This becomes a big sticking point apparently for the team, where The new like creative, I forget what he is, like creative director is butting heads with other people on the team because he's like, there is too much RNG and it's implemented in ways that are really frustrating. And the example used is he played the original Diablo 3 for 100 hours and got one legendary. And he picked up the legendary and it was a bow, and it was like an arrow quill, and he was playing a barbarian which could not use bows. And his point was that should not happen. You should not play the game for 100 hours and never see a single legendary in this loot-based game. Legendary, of course, being like the top tier of item. You should never. It should be rare. Yeah, it should be special. But you should not have to play for 100 hours. Like it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And when you get a legendary, it should not feel like wasted time because it's for a class that you're not playing as, that you're barred from using the equipment of. That feels really bad. So one of the changes they made was every time you kill a boss, like a major boss of the game, you get a guaranteed legendary. So every once in a while, like at the end of each act or something, you will get like a guaranteed kind of boost, a little pick-me-up, and it will be something that your class can actually use. But there's a talk with, one of the other designers, and he's talking about how like they were like, before that point, they were like worshiping at the altar of the dice roll. That dice roll. Dice are the great equalizer. It's the great it's random chance. It's the equalizer. They learned a lesson that I think the Baldur's Gate devs also learned. Here's another anecdote. So Baldur's Gate 3 was in development. It was in early access, but a lot of people just forget, when there's people who are like, Baldur's Gate 3 should be the gold standard now. Or it should be every game should be like that. And it's like, dude, that game was in early access for like 4 years, 3 or 4 years. And it went through so many changes over the course of it. It's ridiculous. Like, no, it was such a particular situation that allowed the Baldur's Gate devs to even do that. Like, that is not realistic for everyone. That game came out as good and as well thought as it did in its like release 1.0 version. One of the changes that was made to Baldur's Gate 3 over its development was that initially the devs went with a dice is law. The dice is law. That was their mentality. If you get a dice roll, that's what the roll is. And players fucking hated it because it feels like shit. It feels like shit when everything is actually just a random roll of like a D12. And they kind of looked at the way that Dungeons and Dragons is actually played, and they kind of realized that, the game in this sense, the game's logic is playing the role of the dungeon master. And generally, a dungeon master who does not have an antagonistic relationship to their players will kind of fudge the numbers a little bit in certain situations, because it's a social thing, right? And if you don't want everyone to just have a miserable time, right? Unless they're like no, I want the hardest fucking thing ever, the hardest, most unpredictable type of game possible. Then yeah, you can leave everything up to dice rolls. But like a discerning DM will look at the situation and like, okay, this guy has just gotten unlucky the last 4 times he's tried to do anything, and he didn't get the roll again. Like, he tried to do something, he failed the roll. I just don't, like, number one, I want things to happen in the game, and number two, it, like, doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to just by the random chance, by the roll of the dice, fizzle on everything. Like, it's like a shitty experience, and it limits the amount of like interaction you feel like you have with the world. Like, how much influence do I even have on the game or the world around me? And so a DM might just say, oh, you got it. You just got it. You just managed to get it. There's essentially like like a tacit, unspoken pity pity system, which is like necessary. And so one of the changes that they made was that sometimes the game just kind of like fudges things for you, and it'll just there is like a built-in rubber banding effect. I'm sure it took quite a while to fine tune it, but there's a rubber banding effect in Baldur's Gate 3 where the game will, like, if you've had enough failures or something, it does start to skew the odds in your favor in hidden ways. And the thing is that if you implement that properly, you don't really feel it, you know? You feel like there's a, I don't know. I think that there's a level of tuning and difficulty where the player doesn't feel like the game is just being handed to them, but they do have to work for it, but it's not just like a miserable experience. And that's kind of like my problem. I don't know, because I like Darkest Dungeon, right? Darkest Dungeon has a lot of similarities to games like this. Actually, it is a dungeon crawler where you go back to town and rest and everything in between dungeoneering sessions. Darkest Dungeon is explicitly about risk management. That whole game is about the appeal, the intrigue of Darkest Dungeon, to me at least, is that the whole game is designed in a way where eventually you're going to fail and things are going to get bad. There will be a cataclysmic series of events that happen, and your skill at the game is related to how well you can mitigate that. How do I move my pieces into place, and what decisions do I make? How do I manage my resources? How do I decide what rooms to go for and which ones to just skip and only do like the critical path of the dungeon? And making those decisions and having an intuition for those is like that it makes it so that when that cataclysmic failure happens, it's not as bad as it could be. And to me, that was very engaging for like the 30 or so hours that I put into that game. There's like there is built-in chance and randomness, but the skill is in working with the randomness, if that makes sense. And I play old CRPGs, and I'm playing Wizardry 6. And if you like this game, fair. I don't dislike it, but there's a level of like, I go into battle, and I click attack. I set all my guys to attack. The game's battle system, the combat system it's very RPG-like. Everyone decides what they're going to do before the combat round starts. Time is frozen, and you go through your party and select, okay, I want you to fight. I want you to use a spell. I want you to hide. I want you to do this. And then you click start combat, and then the game, the combat plays out with different characters acting according to, I think, like their initiative or something like that. And man, like I'm running into situations where I'm like, okay, there are 6 people in this fight, my party and the enemy group included. There's 6 people in this fight, and like 2 rounds of combat go by, and every single attack misses. Not even like, oh, the enemies just have perfect accuracy and I just whiff everything. Like every single attack misses all the time. Just everything just misses. And it's like, maybe I did something wrong. That's the thing, right? This is the CRPG guy coming in and saying, "Whoa, well, are you fucking stupid? Why did you make your party like that?" I'm sorry, man. I didn't know. I just have the manual that's included with the game. I didn't know that I had to build my party to have these specific classes with these skill and spell layouts and this equipment, and that I should be using these skills instead because they have the better to hit chance or whatever, something like that. Maybe the game is or isn't designed like that. I wouldn't be surprised though. But it becomes a little frustrating Mostly just because it feels like shit just fails. Like my actual, like, what can I do? What how much control and like effect do I have on things happening? And not a lot. Like, it's like disempowering in a way that's kind of, I don't know, not very enjoyable to me. And again, maybe I played it wrong. One problem I have with a lot of like CRPGs, old ones especially, is that it's like really easy to play the games wrong, and they punish you brutally for doing so. And that's just not very fun for me. It's just kind of annoying when it's like the game lets you do lets you do something in character creation that is like so bad that you're not going to find out until like 20 hours in, that you're just like screwed. So I said, okay, I'm not having a ton of fun. It's kind of slow. I'm not really sure. I don't have a ton of direction. I'm just kind of exploring the dungeon and getting into fights, and I'm missing a lot of attacks. And you got to save often. These games are about saving often, starting with 6, because that's when you can actually... This is when they drop the permadeath. So you can actually save and load. And the game isn't going to call you a bitch for that. So I dropped it, and I said, okay, I think I get it. I'm going to move on to 7 out of curiosity. So 7, it's interesting because there is a steady increase in enjoyment for me. Remember when I said, as these games go on, now remember when I said that Bradley started introducing different elements into the Wizardry series, kind of new things that were more appealing to me. So the first game starts out, and all the previous games, from what I can tell, are just swords and sorcery. That's the whole thing. Very classic fantasy. There's hobbits. It's not even like trying to hide the Tolkien inspirations. And then 7 starts, and it's like, there's a robot wizard in a spaceship, and he's like, you guys gotta go find the super magic object on this planet. And that's when I went, oh, wait, there's also an evil robot wizard guy who looks super cool. They have this, his whole race has like, his whole like empire has this like dark purple, black, gold robots with like robes and stuff aesthetic. Wait, this looks really cool, actually. What the fuck? So here's when you get in. So all the Bradley stuff I think is neat, because he starts putting all these sci-fi elements into the games that I really enjoy, that I think are really distinctive. And it's funny because it starts to follow what you'd see in something like Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was like, okay, it's a fantasy, but even from the start, there were these sci-fi concepts like airships or time travel, which was like magical time travel. But, you know, it's stuff that you generally only see in science fiction. And then you get to Wizardry 7, and they are very upfront with like, no, there's like aliens, and it's essentially like the world of Wizardry is cool to me now, having played this this second trilogy, because it's a fantasy sci-fi hybrid that basically treats magic and science as like the same thing. And it's kind of cool. It's smart. I don't know if it's the first thing that's done it, probably not, but it basically takes the position that's like, well, there's some quote from someone, I don't know, was it Isaac Asimov or something? I'm not sure. That was essentially any sufficiently advanced technology would be like magic to us, you know? If you went back 200 years and you showed someone some of the stuff we have today, it would be like magic, you know? And Bradley's Wizardry games sort of take off of that quote, and it's like, okay, if magic is something that is like a force. It is a natural force of the universe that can be studied and learned and harnessed. How different is it from something like physics, or like nuclear energy or mathematics? Not really. It would basically be the same thing, and using electricity and technology and developing computers and spaceships and stuff could easily exist alongside what we would just call magic, using these supernatural at that point. It's not even really supernatural. It's just part of the way the world works. You're just harnessing the way the world works. So you get to have these like alien races that are flying around in spaceships, and they go down, and it's like a medieval fantasy with magic and stuff, and it all kind of fits together. That's basically what the later games are like, 7 and 8. They are fantasy adventuring parties that exist on like fantasy planets within sci-fi universes. And it's very cool. It's a very cool, unique aesthetic. So, it's these things that would be fantasy races, like the Umpani, who I like a lot. They're rhinoceros men, but they're like, they're like a spacefaring race that like drops down, and everyone's on this planet, essentially. Everyone's on this planet in Wizardry 7. Crusaders of the Dark Savant. And they're all trying to get another magical artifact thing, right? That's how all these games are. Everyone's trying to get a magic artifact before this evil wizard dude, the Dark Savant, gets it. The gameplay has a noticeable, like, I don't know exactly what is. It's a little hard to pin exactly what feels better about it. I think it's just the balancing. The early parts of the game feel like I can actually do things. Part of it might have to do with the fact that I'm just kind of teaching myself about the way that they work and party composition and stuff like that. Like, the order your party is in actually matters, because it uses a sort of... a lot of Final Fantasy games have this as well. It's there's like a row system, a front row and back row system. And so you probably want to put your mages in the back row, for instance. So just little things that I picked up over the course of playing these. But I don't know, there's an open world in 7 that's very cool. It's all tile-based. These games are all still tile-based, using 2D graphics. But 7 kind of expands the formula a little bit. And it has like cities that you can walk around in that, granted, are very samey and easy to get lost in. But it felt a little bit more like it was approaching a much more fleshed out, a little like it's a dungeon crawler, but there's like, it's expanded, And I think the dungeon crawling is the best aspect. I think the dungeon crawling is easily the most enjoyable part of these games. Kind of all of them. I'm not super into the city stuff, namely because, again, okay. 7 is interesting to me because it feels like it was designed to be a really good dungeon crawler, and then they took the other stuff and kind of like crammed it into that system. Use the bathroom, and I'm back. So, for instance, talking to NPCs. So when you encounter an NPC, here's what happens. They essentially took the framework of the combat system and just kind of like altered it a little bit. It feels like a mod. Basically, you get the same like transition that happens when you encounter an enemy, like literally the same battle music. And they slide onto screen, except now your options are to like talk to them, trade with them, that stuff, like NPC interactions. The shopkeepers do so. First of all, in order to in order to even talk to like the weapons dealer in the first city, he doesn't want to talk to you because he's like a black market dealer. So you have to go find a clue. Oh, you have to go to the inn and then ask about the weapon shop guy, and then he'll tell you about the black market. And then you have to type these things out. These are not like preset like things you can click on, or like you have to actually know and then type them out into a text box in like a parser. And then he'll tell you about that guy's like a black market involved merchant. Then you have to go back to him and then say black market. And then he's like, oh, cool, now you can buy my wares. And the way there's this strict adherence to like tabletop conventions that are totally unnecessary. So, oh god, how do I get... There's like this general cumbersome, like there's a clunk. The clunk in these games. So every character has their own inventory. There is no shared party inventory, and in fact, every character has their own gold like that they keep on them that is separate. Why? I don't know. And in fact, it's pretty pointless because whenever you talk, so you can't buy things as a party. You need to have the individual person talk to the merchant and then buy things for their inventory specifically. And there's just a button to pool all the gold together that you have onto one person. So I don't even know why they have separate gold for everybody. It feels very pointless. Again, just feels like, oh, well, in D&D, everyone has separate inventories and has their own like gold that they keep on them. So that's why, you know, we got to do it in our game, even though it doesn't make any sense. When one person is controlling every single character. So, okay, the menuing is like the worst thing about this game, and it's actually one of the things that made me drop it eventually. I got further in 7. Trust, I got further in 7, but 7 made me... Okay, fucking... So every character has their own inventory. You've got about 20 slots of inventory. This game has... They're just like little things. Like, okay, they have items that you need to identify. Very classic CRPG thing. This is in like Rogue and stuff. You pick up an item and you don't really know what it is, so you have to use a spell of identify on it, and then it'll reveal itself. It typically like will increase the stats of the item now that you understand what it is and all that. Identifying is like an important thing. How do you identify items? There is one class who can identify items, I believe. Or there's like one specific... It's in one of the schools of magic, and that's specialized in by priests, or it's like easier for priests to spec into that. So if I get my priest to learn the identify spell, and I can cast that on the items to identify them. Okay, so how do I cast identify on items in other characters' inventories? You don't. You have to give the items to the priest. How do I do that? Is there just a button to give? No, of course not. You have to drop it on the ground, at which point it will be in the corner of the screen, like the bottom right corner for some reason. I completely missed it the first time I did it. It'll be on the bottom right corner of the screen in a tiny little sprite, and then you click on that, and then you click on the priest to give it to him. And then you can cast Identify on it, and then you have to do so it's like, okay, if I have 6 items I need to identify, it becomes this circus of rotating items between characters and remembering who needs what and what is where and to give what to who. And I have to rest up because it costs so much mana and spell points to identify things. I have to rest every couple ones, and then I rest, and then while I'm resting, I get interrupted by an enemy spawning in, and I have to fight, and half my party is asleep, and I'm like, oh my fucking god. Just like extremely cumbersome process for something that I don't know why. I don't know why it has to be so cumbersome for such a common thing as just casting Identify on items, like kind of a core trait of that class is being able to do that. You want to talk about fucking weird concepts? Wizardry's class system, at least for these two games. So here's how the class system works. When you roll a character, you decide their race and wait, what do you decide first? I think you decide their race and their name or something like that. I don't remember. But essentially, before you decide almost anything, you get a random roll of bonus points. Okay. Bonus points determine what classes are available for that character to choose. If you roll more bonus points, you get more classes to be able to choose. The classes available to you, the threshold for what bonus points you need to roll to get what classes changes depending on race and gender. So, a female fairy has a different bonus point threshold needed, requirement needed to be able to play a thief than a male felper, which are the cat people. Why? I have no idea. This game also has, I think, significant multi-classing. Multi-classing is kind of encouraged in some of these games, because you can switch at certain points. However, if you did not initially roll enough bonus points during character creation, you cannot change classes to one that you did not already meet the threshold for. Why does this system exist? I don't know. I have no idea. It's so silly and strange to me. So I hit this point where I eventually have to go read a walkthrough, and it's okay, what is recommended for me? Because I feel like I kind of need a guide to get through this. And the guide is really good. There are some amazing guides for these games. So it's okay, the next part of the game to go to in order to unlock the next quest line is you have to go into this one building in the main city, in the first city of the game. So I go in, I'm getting my ass completely kicked. So I'm okay, I guess I need to grind more. So I'm grinding, and then my ranger runs out of arrows in his quill. I go to the weapons dealer. He has no arrows for sale. He just doesn't sell arrows at this point in the game. So there is also no other way to get arrows right now. So I'm fuck, what do I do? I go on a forum, and they're at that point, either give him a different weapon to tide you over, but he's going to be a lot weaker. Or you can just change classes. And I go to change classes, and I find out that because I rolled so low on his initial bonus points during character creation, I literally cannot change to anything. I cannot change. The only thing I can change to is a priest. And I already have a priest in my party, so it's redundant. And at that point, I said, I'm just going to drop the game. I'm just dropping it. I'm sorry. Someone's going to tell me I could have done X or Y, but I just kind of hit a limit where it was certainly more playable, but the clunk, the menuing, the certain cumbersome aspects of the game were frustrating to me. I was willing to make it through a certain level of RNG. The first boss in the first dungeon you go through that's underneath the town is this skeleton thing, this skeleton demon thing. You fight it, and every time he spawns, every time you fight him, he appears with he doesn't fight alone, he fights with 2 or 3 to 6 or 7 crows, these blackbirds. And fighting 3 birds versus 6 is a big difference. There's a big difference between those. And I would literally just, if I got too many, I would just reload my save. I would just reload my save. Oh yeah, every time you reload, there's no in-game reload function. You have to click on you have to quit out to the main menu, which thankfully is pretty fast, and then click on load save game. It's thankfully a pretty decently fast process. But, like, oh my god, please just have an option for loading the last save, please. I was willing to put up with that, but there's just like I don't know, certain, just, it's too much RNG in too many places that just bug me too much. I like the presentation, the world is cool, the actual dungeoning was fun enough, finding hidden passages and things like that. I kind of like that it was tile-based. It's kind of neat to me. But yeah, more enjoyable, but I did end up dropping it out of just like, I just hit my limit. Then you get to Wizardry 8, and 8 feels like the game you should have led with. This one was interestingly not worked on by Bradley, although it carries on many of his ideas that he brought into the 6 and 7. Wizardry 8, okay, to start off, before we even get into the gameplay. Wizardry 8's from like 2001. There was like a big gap. There was a big gap. So 6 was 1990, 7 was 92. There was some game called Nemesis, which was like a spin-off in 96. And then in 2001, you get Wizardry 8. And this is the last game before they went out of business. So 8, I boot up the character creation, because same deal. You know, you create a party at the start, which is what, you know, the Final Fantasies and the Dragon Quests took all their inspiration from and all that. The early ones, at least. You start out, even if I think about it, like the multi-classing, maybe it might have inspired like Final Fantasy III's job system. Interesting. Character creation in Wizardry 8 starts, and you can just pick your class from any of them. There's a pretty wide range of classes available. You know, there's like the obvious ones like fighter, mage, thief, but there's some cool ones like gadgeteer, which uses like these gadget items in combat. There's like a lord, which is sort of like the resident tank class. There's Valkyries, which are female. They're the only female exclusive class, and they're like these hybrid DPS divine magic users. There's like psionics, which use mental magic to do stuff like debuff and do like non-elemental spells and stuff like that, and can cause like insanity in opponents and things like that. There's alchemists who can craft potions, of course, and have access to these spell books and stuff like that for casting a lot of their spells. There's like ninjas and samurai, and there's a good variety of classes, and you can just pick them. You can just pick them. There's the only limitation is just that Valkyrie is female only. That's it. You can pick race, class, and sex. And it was immediately so good feeling. It just was so nice to actually feel like I could design my party and not just like, dice roll. Because in like 7, if you wanted to re-roll a character, you're like, oh fuck, I rolled like a 5 for my bonus points. It sucks, you know? Like a 20 would be a really good roll. 5, like, oh god. You have to go through the whole character creation process and like fill out all their stats. You can't go back. You can't just go back and re-roll. You would have to go through the whole thing, and at the very end, just say like, no, delete this one and start over. Like, why? Just let me re-roll. There's no point. Just, again, like, clunk. 8 feels like they just ripped all the clunk out. Most of it. They ripped a ton of it out, and just basic usability things. So you can choose... You can actually customize your character. You can customize their stats. You get to choose what stats, like what stats you want to put points into every single level up. What skills you want to put points into every level up. You get to choose which spells you want to learn. Oh, the earlier games had that, actually. What spells you wanted to learn. So nice. Second off, the menuing is so much better. Oh my god. So 7, like, okay, it's a complex game, right? You've got, in terms of of representing all the information about your character. Because you've got the inventory, you've got the inventory, which in the old games had like the multiple. There's like your top level inventory, and then they have a thing called the swag bag, which is very funny. But that's like your deeper inventory that I think you can't use during combat and stuff. One of the things I didn't mention, again, just like the cumbersome, the clunk, is that in like 6 and 7, your character's equipment takes up slots in the inventory. There are no separate slots for the equipment to go into. Which meant that things just get cluttered because there's certain like plot, like key items that you need to hold on to. There's things that you want to hold on to because they're unidentified yet. And just you've got all this equipment just filling it up. And it was just a lot. Oh yeah, here's another thing. For some reason, those first games started your characters off with like equipment in their inventory, but it was not actually equipped. Really weird. Like they say, every character starts off the game basically at the mouth of the dungeon, ready to go in, but completely naked and just holding all of their clothes in their hands. Like, I guess we should put this on now. And then you have to go in and manually equip everything. It's really, really weird. Wizardry 8 just starts off with everyone equipped with their starting gear. Amazing. You have separate... The inventory is so much better. You have separate slots for your equipment inventory, so now it's not taking up your character's inventory. There is now a shared party inventory in addition to the character-specific ones, which is super nice. And the party inventory is very large. I have not hit the I'm literally still playing it as we speak. I have been really enjoying Wizardry 8. The party inventory is shared. I guess the drawback is you can't use party inventory items during combat. If you want someone to be able to use something during a fight, it has to be in their specific bag, you know? Gold is now shared. Duh, thank you. It's just shared across the whole group. Thank you. Just the UI is so much better. The way that it was represented in 7 was extremely high concept. I'd call it form over function. You can just look up a picture of it. It's basically like, here's a square of your inventory here, and there's like a portrait. It's a literal portrait, like a painting to represent your character's portrait. Their basic stats, there's like a candle that you can click on, which will show you how close you are to getting your next life or something like that, or getting your next level up, I mean. There's a sword and shield that you can click and hold. You can click on, and then it will pop up the menu of your skills. They have like physical, magical, and academic skills in the game that influence different things. And then there's like a suit of armor, and to equip things, you drag it from your inventory to the suit of armor. It doesn't like update, unfortunately. It's just the graphic, and then it just pastes new numbers on top of it. It's neat. It's just like... I go to 8, and it's like, here's just everything. Here's just the stat sheet. You can click on it. It's easy. It's simple. And I'll take that. I mean, maybe there's a happy medium, but 8 is just so much more usable. It's so much easier to exchange items between people. Oh my god. You can actually, like, everyone's got a little portrait in the top corner, the top left corner, and I'm like, okay, I want to give... I picked up this item, and I gave it to for some reason, you can't put things straight into the party inventory. You have to give it to a character, but if the character's inventory is full, it goes into the party inventory. There's like an overflow thing. As far as I can tell you, I can't just take it directly to the party. I don't know why. I'm like, okay, I give it to this guy, but I want to give it to this person. I just go to one person's screen, click on the item in their inventory, go up, click on another person to go to theirs, to their whole screen. And then I just click on an empty space in their inventory, and it just transfers. If I want to identify an item in someone else's inventory, I go to my bishop, and I click on the button at the bottom of the screen, because they knew this was a crucial function. I click on the button at the bottom of the screen that says identify items. And then I go and click on someone else's portrait, and then I just click on the item in their inventory. And it does it for me. Incredible. The amount of information they give you is very admirable. I understand that technically everything was in the manuals of the previous games, but by God, again, clunk. Like, okay, I have to tab out and go to the PDF of the manual that I have that came with the Steam download, and then Control F and hope to find the thing that I'm looking for. Here, it's just, you just right click on the item or the stat or literally anything, and it gives you info about it. So much nicer. So much nicer. Are there any other UI things that I appreciate? I don't know. Everything is just generally way easier to use. Like, such a, just takes... It takes so much of the dragging my feet through the menuing and navigation just out of the experience. Like, just so much of the bullshit out of the experience that doesn't have to be there. And it just, like, lets the game kind of, it lets me interact with the game, you know? The menus are not a barrier to playing the game. I understand that I'm the guy who loves System Shock, but I genuinely think, again, I stand by my thing that once you get used to the menus, they're actually very easy to navigate in System Shock. Everything is actually very, very free-flowing, in my opinion. Yeah, so, oh my god, other things. This game's full 3D. It is a full 3D RPG. Still in first person. It's not tile-based anymore, although I think there's like an option to use tile-based movement. I haven't done that. It's a full 3D RPG in first person with a party. Not many of those. Not many of those, especially not today. The combat system is very cool. I really like the combat in this game and the way that it plays out. It is like an adaptation of the previous game's combat systems in that it is turn-based, but there's an interesting, like, I don't know, it's expanded to account for the fact that the game is, you know, the new dimension, the new axis. Because previously it would just be like, okay, you triggered a random encounter, the enemy slides onto the screen, and you just have the fight. Here it's like, if you see an enemy that's within a certain distance of you, once you get within range of each other, the fight will just start automatically. You will go into combat mode. You can also manually enter combat mode if they haven't noticed you. Once you're in combat mode, you go into freeze frame. You go into frozen time. And essentially, combat plays out in rounds, where rounds are everyone involved in the fight does something. They take their turn, essentially. This includes moving around. So one of the kind of core functions or core things to keep in mind, the previous games had a version of this. If characters were in the back row and they had a weapon that was too short, they could literally like not use melee attacks, for instance. In 8, there is a version of that uses the literal distance between people. So there's actually like a party formation. So you can put your melee characters in the front and your ranged characters in the back. You can put them like on the flanks and stuff like that. And enemies tend to target, they're able to target your party members more easily if they're on their side. There's actual like strategy into the way that you lay your party out in your formation. Characters will also, in order to perform certain, like if a character on the right flank attacks an enemy on the left, they'll like turn, and there's an indicator like on the little UI element of your party formation to show that they've turned to the left, and they're now like vulnerable to like backstabs and stuff like that from where their back is exposed if there's an enemy on the right flank, for instance. And they might take more damage from that. So there's like some pretty interesting strategy to the way that you decide like who to fight. You know, getting surrounded is a real thing that's very bad. You go into, so walking and like running are actions that you have to define that you want to do. It's like a party-wide action. You basically, the combat starts, and every single character has an action that's next to their little segment of the UI on the borders. For most of them, it's pretty like, you know, half or 4/6, 2/3 of my party are just like melee / like ranged classes. I have like a fighter, I have a fighter, a monk, a thief, a ranger, then a mage, and a bishop. And so like 4 of them I just set to do their standard attack. The mage and the bishop I always go and you basically set what action you want them to perform. And then once you've done that, you just click enter or whatever the on-screen button is, and combat plays out as it would. Sometimes if you want to close the gap, then you can click that you want to do a walk or a run. And the first time that you get to act in combat, it just lets you walk around, but you have like a certain amount. You basically have a stamina bar for running or for doing the in-game action. So I can only walk so much. You can only walk so much distance or run so much before you can't. Also, if you go too far, then none of your party members, you can use your turn up entirely by repositioning yourself. So there's like a strategic element to that. For instance, there's like on the road to the first main city after the first big dungeon that the game starts out in, which is very fun. I love that first dungeon. There's like this, I think it's set to be every single time. There's like this sorceress with a band of like highwaymen mercenaries that she's walking with. And they will fuck you up. Namely, she will, because she often starts the fight by casting like a really powerful crowd control spell like Terrify, which can just make your party members too scared to attack when it's their turn. So eventually it took me a lot. Again, this is a game about saving and reloading, and you will get kicked in the mouth playing this game. So you need a little bit of patience. A little bit of patience to kind of break through. Eventually, the strategy I came up with was to just bum rush her as fast as I could, which would force the mercenaries to have to also spend their turns repositioning to get closer to me. And then once I like blew her up with all of my party members, then I could turn on the melee mercenaries, and then it became much easier. But that required me like spending 1, 2, sometimes 3 rounds of just moving and walking and running towards her. The early game doesn't have a ton of direction. It does this thing where I would recommend using a guide, because the game there is no quest indicator. There is no like, let's do this or that. There is a journal, but the journal is very sparse and just tells you about key plot points for the most part. So this is like, the story is an extension on, you know, this has been a whole trilogy, and this is like the final chapter of the Dark Savant trilogy, as it would be called. So, as usual, you have to go get an ancient, magical, powerful artifact before the Dark Savant gets it. And you're enlisted by... Again, like, once they started adding the sci-fi elements, they add, like, the mooks. The mooks are just Wookiees. I love them. My bishop is a mook. I kind of went with very similar party members across all of these, just because I thought it would be fun. And I always make my priest/bishop a mook. For some reason, they're like magically inclined apparently, so they get like more bonuses to their intelligence and piety starting out. So it's like strategic, but also I think it's fun that they're Wookiees. You get it. Remember when I said that, like, yeah, these are like fantasy characters on a fantasy world within a sci-fi universe. So like the start of the game is okay, because I'm just using a fresh party, I'm not importing anyone. The start of the game is, okay, you get enlisted by this Mook guy who is trying to go to this planet called... Ooh, what is the planet called? Dominus? Yeah, Dominus in this game. He wants you to go get this artifact, right? To protect it from the Dark Savant. And the narration of like the main characters is essentially, oh wow, that's a weird metal ship you've got there. How do you make it? How does that? I wonder how that guy makes it sail. And then it just takes off into space, and they have essentially no reaction. They're just like, oh, okay, I guess it's like a different. I guess this is just what it does. It's really funny that in this world of like magic and stuff, that like, yeah, I guess they would see a spaceship and just go, oh, okay, I guess this is just a kind of magic that we don't know about, and we're on a different planet. All right, yeah, it makes enough sense. Unfazed, unbothered. You like crash land on this planet, on this beach side. The pilot, the guy who got you all together, the Mook, dies in the accident, and you got to venture through this monastery, which kind of forms the first dungeon of the game, and it's really cool. It's this abandoned monastery. There's tons of like little optional side things you can do, side bosses, kind of boss monsters, I guess you could call them, really powerful things. Just very fun to work your way through. Do an optional puzzle so that you can get a key that opens a vault that gives you some resurrection powder and things like that. I just had a good time. And then it puts you on the road to the first major city, Arnica, or Arnica? I forget. And you get to Arnica, and there's a character from the previous game who I know because she's in the opening cutscene of Wizardry 7, named Vi Domina, and she's like this sexy sci-fi pirate lady. And her ship she was like captive on this ship that's been crash landed to this savant ship that crash landed in Arnica. And you go into the ship, and there's like this whole fight where you're fighting like the metal guards and stuff like that. And then you can ask her to so here's the other thing that this game does, which is neat, is there is a recruitment system. I don't think the previous games had this, but there's like a recruitment system where NPCs, like quest NPCs, you can just recruit them and they'll join your party. So Vi has just been in my party for a little bit, and we've been doing some quests together. And she's like a Valkyrie, which is cool. So that's, I don't know. I haven't seen that many games do that, but it's a really neat idea for like certain NPC quest lines actually involve you recruiting them and then going and doing a quest with them. So here's my little tip and trick. So the first thing you have to do in Arnica, so Vi is like, oh, I've been gone for so long because I was a captive. I'm gonna go. Why don't we go talk to the old people I knew around town? And then so you go do that, but they don't tell you like the one person that you really need to talk to, who is like the head of the guards. The head of the guard patrol. So here's how you meet him. He is locked inside of the guard like police building, essentially. When you walk up to the police building, a little like sci-fi thing scans you and it says you don't have an ID for it. So how do you get an ID? Well, there is a different building that's like the prison, and you have to pick the lock to get into the prison. Go into like the front office, which is another lock that you have to pick. And then pick a fourth lock or pick a third lock to open a locker, which will give you an ID for someone who works as a guard. And that's how you get into the police precinct. The game doesn't tell you any of this. It doesn't even tell you to go to the like guard headquarters. It doesn't tell you to go to the prison. It doesn't give you any direction on this. This was stuff that like I did those two tasks like hours apart. Literally, like I went in, got the ID, and was like, what do I do? What? And then I remembered, oh, there's like this weird building. Okay, maybe that helps me. And then I go in, and it turns out that that's the NPC you have to talk to. who will give you the direction to the next area. So what I say, like, yeah, you should probably use a bit of a guide to know what to do next. I'm in like the second dungeon, I guess you'd call it, of the game, which is in this like tree city. It's like a city that's all built into like this giant tree that's also like a network of smaller trees. It's very cool looking, and it's inhabited by these kind of fuzzy, weird insect looking guys. And you have to clear the rats out from them. But it's in terms of playability, I think it's way better. I think it's especially like, so I did a bit of rebinding. The game plays by default with just keyboard controls, although mouse look is supported. Turn off mouse look smoothing. It makes the game look awful. I don't even know why it's there. It just snaps your view randomly. It's really bad. Maybe it was made for mice with like different like polling rates or something like that. I don't know. Play with mouse smoothing. I'd rebinded it to just be like a WASD. I changed the relevant key bindings that were like the search mode and all that, which searching is pretty important in this game, because you can get a lot of just free potions from your characters just finding stuff like, oh, hey, there it is. The stats. Oh my god, the stats. I feel like I understand the stats, like the other the more obscure, weird ones. Like, hey, what does the artifacting skill mean? I never understood what that was. Oh, it turns out that it means the higher your artifacting skill is, it's probably like an average of the party's total skill or something like that. Because I don't think it matters which character you give it to. It's essentially once you pick up an item, how likely is it that you can identify it? What is the mythology skill? It is the likelihood that when you encounter an enemy, a character in the party will understand what the enemy is, and you'll get detailed information about its HP. Otherwise, it's just like a mystery how much damage you've done to it. Oh, cool. So having like sufficiently high stats in those areas kind of eases certain things up a little bit. Yeah, I think this game generally just kind of plays a lot better. It's a lot easier to understand. Certain CRPG boomers I've read say that like, oh, it ripped the soul out. Okay, fine. I guess I like the soulless version. Party composition is interesting because I'm obviously not an expert on it. It was rough for like my mage. I was reading a couple guides because I was like, man, my mage feels really weak. And they, some of the guides were like, yeah, pure damage DPS spells are like not amazing in the game. A lot of the game is about like using your magical characters to buff up the whole party. So my mage has learned like sword blessing skills and like a couple crowd control abilities. So now I can just open the fight with like, I'm going to set my bishop and my mage to cast buffs on the party, and then I'm going to have them do DPS until like someone needs a heal, and then my bishop does that, or I need to like CC something, and then my mage does that, and I can actually kind of specialize them. Apparently class/profession switching is not really a thing as much in Wizardry 8. It's possible, but it's not like as encouraged as it was in 7 from what I understand. So I'm just kind of going to be rolling with this party for the foreseeable future in the game. There was like a very handy guide I found on Steam that basically gave a quick rundown of what all the classes do and what kind of stats they should prioritize when leveling up. So that's cool. For the most part, I don't know. I've just been having a really good time with 8. I think 8 is just a genuine, like, it's kind of a shame that this was the last mainline one made by the original developer before they went out of business, because 8 is easily like the most accessible, and it feels like to me like it takes out a lot of all the clunkiness and barriers to enjoyment that the original or the previous games had. The open world is neat. It has kind of a weird like, I was going to talk about difficulty. The difficulty is kind of weird in that the open road is way more dangerous than, like, the dungeons, which is odd. The dungeons feel like they're tuned to be taken on at certain points in the game. The just, like, roads from place to place are, like, way less forgiving. Like, bands of enemies, which can sometimes group up, and there is, like, a slightly annoying thing that happens in this game where sometimes you'll be in a fight and it goes on for long enough that nearby enemies get alerted and they join the fight, and it just gets bigger and longer, and it's, like, a little annoying. But other than that, enemies are just, like, way closer, like, higher in level on the road, and there's more of them, and you really have to stick to, like, the mountainside walls and stuff like that, as opposed to taking the main path, because that's where the enemies typically rove. Very interesting balancing decision, but then as soon, like, literally once you get into the main dungeon, like, content areas, I guess I'd call it, it gets way easier. It gets way more like, okay, this feels like I'm supposed to be taking this on at around the level I'm at. Very strange. But I don't know. It made me see the vision. And it kind of made me curious about, like, all those Japanese spin-offs and stuff now. Yeah. Is there anything else I want to talk about with Wizardry 8? I don't know. It is the one, like, I think I've given a decent description of the games up till now. In my voice, right? Some of these things might sound appealing to you, in which case, check them out, right? If I was going to recommend any of them to someone like me, who is not, like, a CRPG boomer and doesn't necessarily love getting my balls kicked as, like, a game design philosophy, then I would probably recommend 8. It is tough, and there are, like, bizarre difficulty spikes at certain points, but I would call it the most approachable and least prickly of all of them, with a little bit of rebinding and just using mouse look and stuff like that. That's my recommendation. Check it out. Actually cool games with a cool world. Some people don't like the sci-fi stuff, but to me, that just makes it more interesting. I mean, like, I am the most, like, oh, whoa, cool, hang on. There's a cool robot in it now? Wait. I'm gonna... let me stick around and check this out. That's me. That's who I am. Yeah, that's my recommendation. That's been my retrospective of the second trilogy of Wizardry games. So check those out if any of those interest you. Man, I filled up a whole podcast talking about 3 games. I guess I had a lot to say. I also talked a lot about, like, the history of mainframes. Man, this is going to be a weird one to clip. If that's kind of where I'm at. That's kind of, yeah, I don't know if I have too much else to talk about. I'm going to probably draw it to a close now. If you have listened this far, thank you for listening to me ramble about 3 video games. If you have any questions for me, leave them down in the comments below, and I will definitely get to them next time. But please phrase it in the form of a question, because I'm not just going to read your thoughts out loud. Video is in progress. You can check out my Patreon and my Ko-fi. Check out my main channel and my side channels and everything. I haven't made a side channel video in a while. I should when I get the inspiration. Maybe I will. Until then, I think that's it. I think that's it for things I want to shill. Bye.